Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Mike, for that introduction, and thank you, Pat, for including me in this conference. As you've noted earlier, I've served you in the past doing what Michael does now, and as a panel moderator, but this is actually the first time that Pat asked me to say something. I appreciate it, but I don't know that she realized the door that she opened. I have to tell you that when General Bingham came up, there was a little bit of professional envy involved. First, she put up slides, and I thought those were the good old days when somebody would help you do that. But after it worked out, I'm not so sure. But I am envious of the job she has, the ability she has to work with the soldiers at the range, the joint missions that are supported, the mission that has, and the heritage of White Sands. What a great command that she has right now. Old habits die hard, Michael. I'm going to keep my tie on. I'm just too old. If we were in a bar, we could cut it off, but I'm not going to take it off right now. After one of our volunteer leaders speak, I occasionally get email along the lines of, can't you control what your AIAA people say? The answer is, when they're speaking for AIAA, generally the answer is yes. But our leaders very rarely speak on behalf of AIAA. We have a very cumbersome process for approving policy statements, so we never get one out. When they're in an environment where there's some confusion, they usually identify who they're speaking at for. And if it's for their company or it's for themselves, the answer is no. I can't control them. I shouldn't control them. I don't even try. So even though I've got a few more days as executive director, Pat invited Bob Dickman to speak and to give his personal thoughts. That's what you'll hear. That'll probably become obvious, and Sandy will probably get some email. I spent most of my career involved with national security space. I may be returning to the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board this fall if the paperwork actually ever gets done, and I look forward to returning to those roots. Civil space with its commercial dimensions has been absolutely exciting over the past 8 years. I've enjoyed learning about it. You all have lived it. But I'll tell you, the amount of internal squabbling, the backbiting, the name-calling, posturing, politics that seems to be attracted to every aspect of the business that we're involved in absolutely amazes me. Every decision seems like an invitation to a public and often acrimonious debate. The net result, I'm afraid, is both sub-optimized for success and damaging to our efforts to attract the best and the brightest into our profession. In the same week in August of this year, we heard on one hand that Curiosity's landing on Mars was second only to Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon as a space-related engineering accomplishment. And on the other, that NASA has no vision, no plan, and has lost the ability to do anything exciting. How's that for a recruiting pitch? By way of example, NASA has 2 significant launch programs underway. Many of the proponents of one, the Space Launch System, believe that the key to NASA's future is the big rocket. The main purpose is exploration, NASA's core mission. But many of them also see NASA as the only organization that can safely build a system that can carry NASA astronauts. The proponents of the other program, transitioning U.S. access to low Earth orbit from shuttle to commercial providers, believe that after launching things to low Earth orbit, people and cargo, for hundreds of times over 55 years on expendable rockets and on the shuttle, it should become routine. We should be ready to turn to industry for launch to LEO, carefully but inexorably, and hopefully in a way that allows for commercial success. Both are funded by the same big NASA pot. Neither is funded adequately. Both, with different names, some variations, has spanned both the Bush and the Obama administrations. My point is not to take sides in this, at least not in the first couple of minutes of my talk, but just to use it as one example of the squabbling. Big science, little science. Space science, Earth science, moon, Mars, asteroid, sample return, in situ instruments, human exploration, robotic missions. I think the American public could be forgiven for wondering why a bunch of rocket scientists can't figure out what we want to do next. While I will keep returning to launch, since this is a space flight symposium, Pat asked me to both look back and look ahead. I'll start by looking back. And I'll try to dispel that assertion that NASA, and more broadly you, the aerospace industry and profession, are no longer capable of doing anything important. The prospect for the future is even worse. While there's no one giant step in either the recent past or the immediate future, the assertion would be almost laughable if we didn't hear it so often. You can't be in this audience or hear what will be talked about over the next couple days and believe that it's true. We could spend all day talking about the short list that I'll mention. And I'm sure each of you have ideas about what's happened in the last decade that I've left off. So rather than provide details, I just ask you that as I go through this short list, you think back to where you were and what you were doing when these things happened. We'll start with the landing of the rover on Mars. No, not Curiosity, Spirit, then Opportunity, January 2004. If Spirit hadn't broken through some crust on top of some really fine sand, they'd probably both still be producing good science today, 6 or more years after their expected mission duration. But perhaps even more important, if they hadn't worked, we probably wouldn't have had a Mars Science Laboratory this August. Nothing breeds success like success. Spaceship One, White Knight, private travel to the edge of space, and the glimpses we've seen of what's ahead at the spaceport that many will visit on Friday. The birthing of Falcon 1, the early failures, and then the successes of that upstart. Falcon 9, 3 flights of Dragon, including 2 dockings. Doubters, go home. The CubeSat, the nanosat revolution, the opportunities that they're giving students to do hands-on work on systems that will go to space. At the break, go out to that little exhibit out in the front corner, right where you walk in, and see those things that students are building, and they're flying out of white sands to suborbital altitudes. Kepler, its amazing discoveries of far more planets around stars than at least most of us, certainly me, ever thought could be detected if they were even there. Hubble repair, the last one in 2009, far more complex than anything we've ever tried to do like that before. I'm not sure which pictures I actually enjoy more, looking at the things that Hubble took or looking at the pictures of those repairs. Pretty amazing stuff. STS-135, as Lori said, the safe and very successful conclusion of that remarkable era. ISS completion. What an achievement in engineering and international cooperation. And finally, Curiosity. How cool was that entry, descent, and landing? And now it's starting to do what? What it was sent there to do, and it's already looking like it's finding things that are really going to be exciting. To be sure, there were some tough times during that past decade. The Columbia accident, programs canceled, enormous overruns, lots of indecision. But the things that have gotten to orbit, NASA and national security and commercial, have almost, without exception, performed better than spec, better than even their proponents have hoped. ISS assembly defies the imagination, especially how little we could do 10 years ago in EVA compared to what was being done in those last 30 shuttle missions as the system was completed. Now, I'm not buying that the lights are out at NASA or that our aerospace industry has lost the recipe on how to deliver amazing capabilities, but neither am I buying that all good things come from NASA or from the government more broadly. The most exciting thing about the past decade as an indicator of the future is the growth of commercial space. Obviously, spaceflight, but also geospatial imagery, GPS applications, communications, and so many more things that are going on. Now, I think my biggest frustration in our business, one that's been brought home to me, unfortunately, very clearly over my time with AIAA, as I've attended conferences both in the United States and around the world, is the incredible cost and timelines for government-funded and managed programs. It seems like a government program today can't be taken seriously if it doesn't have 9 or 10 zeros in the budget and take the better part of a decade or more. I'm sure everyone here can identify one horror story of another, probably that you've been involved with. Space-based infrared, advanced EHF, NPOS, Constellation, James Webb. Even today's poster child, Curiosity, was slipped from one Mars launch opportunity to the next and was way, way over budget. The SLS, that space launch system I mentioned earlier, was formally introduced a year ago. Now, I'm probably not the only one, even in this audience, that detected some similarity between the SLS and the Ares rockets of the Constellation program. So presumably there was some design legacy from Ares, from the shuttle work, even from Apollo. The budget estimates last fall indicated that it would cost $10 billion to develop the rocket. $6 billion for the capsule on top, $2 billion to modify the shuttle pad, and the other things at KSC. It's intended to serve as the government-provided backup for commercial crew. Carry a 4-person crew to lunar orbit. Landing on the moon, actually moving beyond carrying somebody beyond to there and back, would take the upgraded 130 metric ton version. NASA recently selected 26 proposals for advanced development on the components of that system, whose first mission would be at least a decade in the future. That looking to the future and investing now on things that are today's technology frustrates me. I read in a press announcement a few months ago that there was a team at JSC working on various diets that could be used for crew trip to Mars. It was actually mentioned in yesterday's daily launch. Some senator had a list of like Proxmire's Golden Fleece Awards, and it got one. To draw a timeline analogy, it would be like asking people during World War II to work on the menus for the Apollo mission. The answer in World War II would probably have been Spam, maybe K-rations. Now, Spam, by the way, for those of you who are younger, was an awful meat mixture long before it was something that happened to your computer. It comes from spiced and ham. It was made by Hormel. You can still buy it at the store, and it's still great, at least compared to K-rations. My point is that GIs were eating Spam in 1944, and Apollo 11 landed in 1969, 25 years later. Will we have a crew on Mars in 25 years? Maybe. I don't think so, but maybe. But do we need to worry about their diet now? Now, I don't mean to fault those people. I'm sure they're doing good stuff for space station as well. But you can read the same kind of releases about doing technology and demonstrations on crew habitats and mobility systems, the spacesuits, all sorts of things that we're not going to need for a decade, probably two. In the meantime, we're struggling to find funding to send robotic missions to Mars and moons of other planets. We might find some really interesting stuff, and adequately fund so many other things in the NASA budget that are being cut now. But this is a spaceflight symposium, so as I look ahead, let's return to spaceflight. It seems to me that most of the turmoil that we're involved in today is really a tension between sustaining capability, a workforce, and an infrastructure that's proved its worth over 5 decades and more. We're closing the door on some of that in favor of change, sometimes remarkable change. But change is hard, especially if you're on the declining side of the change. The shuttle was a great system, but if the decision hadn't been made 8 years ago to shut it down, we'd have put off even longer working in a serious way on the next transportation systems. While it's now clear that launch as we know it will change, I expect we'll see a shakeout in the industry as the old way gives way or evolves to address the new. One example we're already seeing is in liquid rocket propulsion. If the Aerojet propulsion of Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne goes through, the 3 major liquid space propulsion houses of the space age will be one. These companies have an amazing legacy that dates back to the 1950s. And among them, they provided the first and the second stage of the Atlas, the Delta, the Titan, and of course the shuttle. Perhaps these 3 proven performers in liquid propulsion, with their cultures and facilities and experience, will all endure in one company. I certainly have no insight about that, but I'd be surprised. It just doesn't seem to me that the demand is there going forward. Propulsion community has a pretty tight group. The measures of quality for decades has been improved ISP with improved thrust to weight. They've worshipped at that altar. Most traditional propulsion folks would say that the most efficient liquid engine and combustion efficiency that's ever been built is the Space Shuttle main engine. Per dollar, the most efficient would probably be the oxygen-rich stage combustion engines that are on the Atlas V and Antares. Both of those are made in Russia. I said that most traditional propulsion folks would say that. Per dollar, the most efficient are the RD-180 and the NK-33. Of course, Elon Musk wouldn't say that. Regardless of what's in the numerator, if the denominator is cost, he's almost certainly right. The Merlin's a modern, old hat, a gas generator, locks kerosene, relatively low thrust compared to the bigger first-stage engines that everyone else is flying. It's a piece of machinery that seems to be very well designed and adapted to its use. The traditional community doesn't flock to it. In many regards, they don't even acknowledge it exists. It doesn't squeeze out the last second of ISP, but it's pretty darn innovative in a lot of ways. As we saw in the last mission, they fly with the capability to go engine out on most of their missions. It's proof positive that the old way isn't the only way. Now, we're all products of our environment. My thinking about human spaceflight has been shaped far more by what was going on around me than by any direct involvement. Yes, I would love to have gone to space, Michael. I never got the chance. I think that may be true for many in our business and for almost all the American public. The topic has several dimensions, and I think it will be helpful if up front, as I draw the distinction between exploration and traditional other human spaceflight, that I go through it in a little bit of detail. Apollo was exploration. Mercury and Gemini were steps along the path to exploration. Exploration has an essential component of going somewhere or doing something for the purpose of discovery. I understand that some, perhaps many, would disagree with that narrow definition. In fact, I would agree that the early Russian, early American astronauts going to LEO were exploring. They were going somewhere and discovering what was and wasn't there. Beyond that, though, I think we've been going to LEO either to learn how to do something that was important for some future activity, or we were going there to do something productive in itself. Learn how to rendezvous and dock for Apollo, do experiments on Skylab or Salyut or Mir or ISS, build things, repair things, recover things, or even just carry something there, satellites or cargo or people. That doesn't diminish in any way the importance or the dangers involved in spaceflight to LEO. It simply distinguishes between the purpose of the flights, between exploration, and all the other reasons to do human spaceflight. So, by my definition, since the earliest days of human spaceflight, exploration has been the sole province of the United States, and paused, I was going to say stopped, but I'll say paused, for almost 40 years ago. Not so for the broader human spaceflight. To me, that's the process of carrying humans to space for whatever reason, carrying humans to the global commons, to work, to play, to visit, to be a tourist, to learn, to explore, whatever. It's an activity that's open to any nation, or company, or individual with the will, the resources, and the technology. So far at the nation level, the United States and then Russia, the Soviet Union and then Russia, the United States, and China have done human spaceflight to orbit. In fact, we have launched humans into orbit how many times? Over 250. I doubt many in the public could come up with that number. That's not the number of astronauts, that's the number of separate flights to low Earth orbit with people on board. The fact that it's happened on average about every 2 months for the entire life of most of the American public makes it a little easier to understand that spaceflight, even human spaceflight, isn't something that gets people excited anymore, other than those that are involved or those who want to go. Much of the space transportation debate really revolves around whether human spaceflight to LEO and space exploration well beyond Earth orbit benefit from two different launch systems. My personal opinion is that they do. Several years ago, I stated in testimony with the Senate Science Committee that the Ares 1 was a bad choice for getting to the International Space Station. Maybe that's why Senator Nelson never invited me back. I would say the same about SLS if I was asked. It's a step towards exploration, but it isn't a good solution for getting people to LEO. We don't need it to support the space station. SpaceX has a better answer, so does ULA and Boeing and Sierra Nevada and ATK, and probably other companies as well. SLS may retire the risk for future exploration vehicles, but I'm afraid we're going to spend an awful lot of money making it capable of doing something that we really don't need. Whether the SLS is the right answer for exploration is an entirely different question. Why shouldn't something like today's SLS be the core of our exploration program? And I think it's because we're talking about a launch vehicle that we will use in 2040 or beyond. That's well within the lifetime of the SLS if it launches first in 2017 as planned and is in the inventory as long as the Shuttle or Atlas or Delta or Titan. And I just can't believe that as good as they are, the liquid and solid propulsion technologies of the Shuttle main engine and the Shuttle SRBs and even the Apollo J2 are the best we'll be able to do 50 or 60 or more years after they flew. I don't want to see a few seconds of ISP improvement in our next generation launch system. I want to see a big step. I want to see as big a step as from Saturn to Shuttle. We aren't ready to do that yet. We don't have the technology to do that yet. But I don't want to preempt what might be possible with an arbitrary timeline. Now, obviously, I'm a lot more supportive of what's going on with respect to getting to LEO. The COTS and the Commercial Crew Programs, EELV, the range of private and personal spaceflight initiatives, orbital and suborbital. As recently as 2 years ago, many naysayers were very vocal about their doubt that any commercial firm would demonstrate the necessary reliability and safety to carry astronauts for many years, perhaps as long as the entire decade. Even carrying crew to station wasn't a sure thing. Not so much anymore, thanks in large part to Dragon mission last May and the launch last week and the docking. Naysayers also doubt that there's enough money to be made for this industry to sustain itself. Maybe one company carrying astronauts a couple times a year to a space station that has a finite lifetime, but not an industry, not tourism, not traffic other than station. The American public, as best I can tell, doesn't care what the naysayers say. In fact, they're getting excited. The New York Times ran a piece early this year about space tourism, and it wasn't poking fun. While the up and down flights of Virgin Galactic is offering are very different from human space flight that would take people to orbit, the distinction isn't so obvious to many others. As the Times article said, going to space will be less expensive than buying a house, and there's a lot of people in line willing to go. I think just as indicative of the place that commercial space tourism is beginning to take in our society was an advertisement that ran by Nike. It ran on ESPN last winter during the basketball season. It featured Kobe Bryant speaking to a number of very senior leaders from around the world about what he called the Kobe system, about adapting and winning. It was shtick. It was pure shtick from a shoe company. But as Kobe looks around the room of the people he's talking to, identifies each leader by his or her role, he points to the person in the center row and he says, "You own outer space." And Sir Richard Branson slowly nods and says, "I do. I promise you that within a few weeks, more young people recognized Sir Richard and identified him with space than would recognize Charlie Bolden or Mike Griffin or anyone in our business except maybe Elon." The Times article concludes by observing that the entrepreneurs that have introduced space ventures include Richard Branson of Virgin, Elon Musk of SpaceX, Jeff Bezos of Blue Origin, Paul Allen, who backed Spaceship One and now Stratolaunch Systems. We all know the quip. The way to become a millionaire in the space business is to start out as a billionaire. These guys aren't dummies. They've been among the most successful in the world at delivering innovative, game-changing products. They probably won't all succeed, but they all won't walk away either. More to the point, though, is that the American public is seeing a different face on human spaceflight. It's not the big government agency that made its name doing things that had never been done before, launching incredibly talented, polished astronauts into engineering marvels to work on or in other engineering marvels. It's highly successful entrepreneurial businessmen who promise to launch them, real people, into space. That's good marketing, better than we've done for the rest of the space program. How we sell human spaceflight and space as a national priority is not an insignificant issue, and we, the profession and the government, just haven't done it very well. For most of 3 decades, from the mid-1970s until 2004, the public heard us, the aerospace community in NASA and virtually everywhere else, basically say that going to space on the shuttle and eventually deciding to build a space station with it was a sufficient goal in itself. With a couple of exceptions that got no traction, exploration or anything beyond LEO wasn't a serious part of the space dialogue. In late 2004, President Bush, in the wake of the Columbia accident, announced his vision for space exploration. It was a driving force inside NASA, got support from the Congress. I think many in the community, we were just grasping for a return to the heyday of Apollo. There would be big budgets to do exciting things with lots of visibility, lots of support, lots of continuity, lots of jobs, lots of enthusiasm. Space would be on top again. My impression is that the public neither knew nor cared about that vision. In 2004 and in 2012, we aren't in a space race, a race that was described in the 1960s as an element of a bigger race for the survival of the country. Space was the high ground. The moon was the ultimate high ground. Those days are gone forever. The public doesn't care about a space race with China. The American public isn't impressed with the idea of going back to the moon. No matter how often the scientists and astronauts say there's good, important work to be done there, or how bad it would be if someone else goes back before we do. Internationally, of course, the situation is different. In 1969, that one small step became both the iconic moment seen around the world and the metric by which any spacefaring nation would be measured. Launching satellites to orbit is good. Launching humans to orbit is better. But only one nation, the most powerful and successful nation on the Earth, has gone to the moon. If you want to be in that league, you've got to go there. In 2 months, we'll see the 40th anniversary of the last explorer's departure from the moon. If it was easy, others would have followed a long time ago. Now they're planning to go there. Don't bet against China, or India for that matter. Will the world come to an end? Will Western civilization as we know it be rocked when that happens? I don't think so. Others do. They're often smarter than I am, but I don't think so. So far, we've been talking about human spaceflight at distances that were within the reach in the 1960s. The challenge of transportation is much greater for space exploration beyond LEO, to Mars or beyond. Many of you have heard the Joe Rothenberg Transit Time Mars quiz. It took Curiosity over 8 months to get to Mars. Launch on November 26th, EDL on August 6th. Now, suppose instead of launching to low Earth orbit, getting all your velocity and then coasting for 8 months, you could get to Earth orbit and then you could accelerate at 1G. Get halfway there, turn around, decelerate at 1G, so you got to Mars basically in the same state as Curiosity, or actually even moving slower. What would the transit time be? Carl, any idea? 3 days. Simple equation. You can calculate it. 3 days. 1/10 of a G, 30 days. Now, 1G acceleration, constant acceleration is unobtainium. 1/10 of a G might be unobtainium. But if we want to explore, especially if we want to do more than just put footprints in the Mars dust, we want to go further, we want to go with lots of missions, if we want long duration stays, we've got to get beyond the traditional systems for in-space propulsion. We've got to make the trips manageable, survivable, and sustainable. That's the real long pole for exploration beyond the moon or an asteroid, not getting 130 metric tons into low Earth orbit. Solving that problem isn't about working harder at what we know how to do now. It's basic research, and it's amazing engineering. It may not even be possible, although I refuse to accept that. I'm a physics major by trade. Anything that doesn't defy the laws of physics is possible. It's just a matter of smart people figuring it out. For my money, I'd rather see NASA put a bigger chunk of the exploration funding into that kind of research if we're serious about exploration. And I guess that's the real question. Are we serious about exploring? There's plenty of data if you poll the American public with an open-ended question about whether mankind should explore space. The answer is almost universally yes. When you add a modifier, explore space now, or put in a destination, the moon, Mars, and even an asteroid, the support for a definite program clearly drops off quickly. In today's zero-sum budget environment, when the question is explore space instead of doing X, Y, Z, some other program or some entitlement, you can see how much interest space exploration has generated among the candidates for president. If it doesn't interest the public, they're not going to talk about it. I don't know how to make the case in a way that a president with other priorities would advocate, a skeptical Congress would fund, or that an uninterested public would embrace. So I guess my approach to selling is a little different. I think the most important ingredient to making the next bold step in exploration is to make access to LEO routine, affordable, and accessible to anyone. Until the public believes that we can go a couple hundred miles into space and back with high confidence that they can go, going 1 million miles will forever be seen as too hard by all those except the true believers. Obviously, that's where you all come in. You're the ones in the arena working to make it happen. Yeah, NASA's made a big difference with COTS and the commercial crew programs. I applaud FAA, the team at AST and FAA. They continue to work to make and keep the regulatory environment as friendly as practicable to help the people trying to break new ground. But the real work is what you're doing, developing the systems that will get humans to suborbital and orbital space, will meet NASA's needs, will fly within the FAA regulations, and will make a profit while doing it. Finally, let me offer one more thing, even more outlandish, that might excite the public, might even excite Congress. One of the great lost stories of the early space age and the space race has to be the missions of Luna 16, 20, and 24. Now, I'm sure you remember those missions. Anyone? Carl, of course. They brought moon rocks back to Earth. Now, we don't remember that, and it's not surprising that we don't, because Luna 16's return to Earth didn't happen until Apollo 14 was about ready to launch. The total return from the 3 missions was about 12 ounces, compared to 842 pounds from Apollo. A little bit anticlimactic, but I bet we'd all know about Luna if the Soviets had returned a sample, even a small one, in, say, July of 1968. I was glad to see the review by Orlando Figueroa recommended a sample return mission for Mars. Basically, the approach is for a sequence of missions to search and find things and analyze them, centrally store them for some future sample return mission. The current thinking is it would take at least 3 missions over 3 different Mars launch windows, starting no earlier than 2018. The initial price, $5 billion, multiply by 2 or 3, pick a number, I just don't believe the 5. I just don't have any confidence that a sample return program that would take the better part of 15 years from now to execute, at least $10 billion, would be sustained in today's environment. If we want an exciting program, and wouldn't a sample return program be a whole lot more exciting if Curiosity finds some evidence of early life on Mars? It seems to me that we need to look for revolutionary ways of accomplishing that mission. My experience with big government programs makes me very doubtful that revolutionary change is going to come from inside. Some technology, maybe a lot of the technology, but not the systems. Not anymore. The government system is too risk averse. The political system is too wedded to jobs and job protection and status quo. But what if there were a prize for a sample return? Say it required 16 ounces from each of 8 locations on Mars separated by 200 meters. 1 landing. Say the samples had to be returned to NASA by 2025. The winner would get to keep a ½ ounce of the sample from each 8 places. You know there's going to be some serious commercial value in that. Make the prize $1 billion. Or for those of you who watch NFL games, as Peyton Manning says to Papa John, make it 2. Sure, it's crazy, but so were the Ortiz Prize in 1927 and the Ansari Prize in 2004. With a challenge like that, a big, big reward at the end of a high risk, how long do you think it would take before Elon would take it on, or Sir Richard, or Paul, or Jeff? How many of us would want to work on that kind of program led by that kind of entrepreneurial spirit? It would make SpaceX today look like a practice field. That's what it was like in the 1960s. Every kid that could balance an equation wanted to work in the space business. Those days are gone forever, but the excitement of doing really breakthrough stuff, working in an environment where everyone is challenged to deliver even more than anyone expects, where risk and failure are parts of the process that leads to success, where the whole is indeed greater than the sum of the parts. It still exists, not everywhere to be sure, probably not in most places, but the pockets are there. Many of you work in them, entrepreneurial companies, and also hidden away within the big guys. My organization, AIAA, was born in that environment, 1963. Over the years, I think that we, along with much of the industry and the profession, got complacent. We were comfortable with what we were doing. AIAA is changing, just as you're trying to change the industry. Our new space forum, starting in 2013 and reaching maturity probably in 2014, is going to feature much of that integration and system-level focus and the companies and the overall excitement that are still around if we know where to look for them. And I can't wait to see that change. So thank you for including me here, and I look forward to seeing you there. God bless.
Very great comments. Thanks for your incredible insight. And I'm going to impose on that perspective to answer a few questions. The first is, you mentioned on the NASA side, SLS, Orion, commercial, planetary exploration, technology development with higher ISPs and propulsion that can get us 1G constant acceleration.
You were listening.
My question is, sort of what I asked Lori, if you could write the NASA authorization, or if you could divide the pie up, how would you do that?
I think you can't cut little pieces off things. I would stop SLS. I would say we're going to push that off for 10 or 15 years. I'd put a bunch of money into research for that. I'd go back and put more money into aeronautics because there's a whole bunch of NASA that has nothing to do with launch that just isn't getting done. I'd put far more money in both NASA and across NASA through initiatives and also for funding into students and student programs. So that the kids that are going in school now get challenged with really tough stuff. The investment you can get in a student is enormous. I mean, we throw away billions of dollars on a program. We'll divide that billions of dollars by $20,000 for a graduate student. I mean, you can fund an awful lot of students doing really, really good work. So I would put emphasis there. A commercial crew would go faster than it does now. If the limiting factor is dollars, I'd make that factor go away. I would assume that things that are going on in the commercial spaceflight world, the world you are in, some will succeed, some will fail, but I'd invest in them. Try to make that work faster. I certainly would not follow any of the discussion on the Hill of going down to one. If instead of going to one, I'd go to 2 or 3 or 4. I'd make it so that at least for those first few years, those companies wouldn't have to survive on a NASA budget that involves specifically carrying cargo when there's not enough cargo and not enough people. And then the government can back out once that fledgling industry is formed. So those are the kind of things I do.
If you note the sort of expanding capacity that the commercial launch industry has, with the coming online of Dragon and Cygnus here soon and others in the suborbital world, where do you see the payloads and the research coming from to fill those vehicles?
I hate to use if they will build it, if you will build it, they will come. But I think there's some of that. I think what we're seeing, for example, with students, is that the opportunity to go fly is causing relatively small investments to lead to just gaggles and gaggles of experiments that want to get flown. Where's the lady from Ames? Yeah, there you are. She's from the office that's trying to get these things flying. It's amazing. They are going to be so swamped with proposals. I think what we don't want to do is build more billion-dollar spacecraft. I think we want to figure out what you can fly to orbit that doesn't cost some fraction of the gross national product and get stuff up, accept that it'll fail. The DoD is trying very hard to move their paradigm from the big system to the small. You can't do that in one step because we don't know what the little systems can do and how they're going to work. So flying some, testing some, putting more things in space like that, I think, is the way you fill those manifests, at least in the early days. And at some point, they have to be able to survive economically, commercially, and at that point, they're on their own.
So going back to your comment about having more than one provider for crew transportation to LEO, how do you answer the critics, some in Congress, that say NASA's job should not be to develop a capability, but rather to make a service? So our goal ought to be to get our astronauts up there, not necessarily to line the pockets of these entrepreneurs who are doing okay by themselves anyway, by making a commercial market for them.
The NASA Act that was written in 1958, and every policy statement since then from the White House has said that part of NASA's mission and part of the entire government's space mission is to foster commercial space. So those who say that NASA shouldn't be doing that just have it wrong. They just have it wrong. Right? At some point, you back away, but you've got to invest. You've got to be the anchor tenant up front. It frustrates me in commercial imagery, which is something probably none of you work in, but 2 companies have been fostered along, and they took the technology out of the NRO and those companies, obviously. Well, we just canceled one of the contracts. The companies are figuring they have to merge. Well, it's exactly the wrong answer. We're trying to go back into the government instead of fostering commercial. The law says do it. The policy says do it. It's only the people who don't want to do it that say they find a reason not to.
Back on the issue about developing technology, you mentioned sort of humorously this idea of spam and what the folks might be doing, too far in advance. There's another aspect of that says if you don't work on developing the next spam today, that you're going to erode our core capability.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Mike. The difference is whether or not you're working on food for an astronaut 25 years ahead of time, where you're doing the basic research that's going to lead to a breakthrough in propulsion technology or materials technology or something like that. That's what we should be doing. I'm not sure that we need to be working on astronaut suits to use on Mars, because we're not going to use them for a couple decades. And the technology that we're going to look at today, just like that spam for food, is going to be irrelevant 20 years from now. So push that stuff off, put the research money into the things where we really need the breakthroughs, the really fundamental breakthroughs that may take 20 years to end up in a fielded system.
In your hat as the DoD space architect, you sort of had a global vision, and much like I asked you the question about, how would you write the NASA authorization if you could, do you think there's a role for a figure in the commercial world that could be the commercial space architect?
No. Commercial really needs to find its own way. I agree. We need something like the old National Space Council. We need something that can look over the government processes in space, the DoD, national security, and NASA, maybe not with directive power, but certainly with influence, that can make sure that what the government is doing isn't contrary to what makes sense for a commercial company, but also to deconflict what's going on within the government. There's plenty of things in the government that we do collectively in NASA and in DoD that we should be doing together. We've known that for decades. It's the institutional separations that keep that from happening. And I think there really does need to be somebody at the top to make that happen. Or at least to be able to identify that it's happening with enough clout, with presidential support, that the Congress interest that we want to keep the things separate might be able to be overcome.
So along the lines of trying to depoliticize NASA, at least, there has been some talk about a new proposal to maybe have the administrator serve a much longer term, perhaps appoint a board of directors that would be in charge of NASA. Can you comment on that idea or anything like that?
I don't know. I don't know that you can depoliticize NASA. It's a government agency that spends a lot of money, that has an awful lot of influence on a lot of things. It's not like law enforcement. So I probably wouldn't go down that road. I think NASA having one of the dilemmas that the federal government has, and Lori referred to it kind of inversely, was we have this thing called FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And if you're on a FACA and you try to provide really good advice that's from the heart, you're probably toast, because everything that a FACA does is in public. The assumption is that if you have a closed meeting, the cigars will get lit, the scotch will come out, and the lies will start to be told. You really need some environment whereby a group could advise the administrator of NASA and the director of the NRO and the head of the National Security Space Program in a really closed environment. The NRO has a way of doing it. They just put a classification stamp on it all. But they don't have a FACA. They have an advisory group. And I think that's a tough problem for us, because you really need to get smart, experienced people able to advise in a setting where they're not going to be quoted and pilloried for what they say.
This is a little bit closer to your current job. What efforts or programs are there at AIAA that target small businesses? It seems that a lot of your constituency are large corporations.
Oh, thank you. Klaus is already laughing. Actually, Eleanor Aldridge has been a major proponent for quite some time on commercial space initiative we have. We have a large small business initiative that goes on. Bob Wynn was a major leader in that. More than half of our companies are small businesses. We do trivial things, if you will, but if you're a small business and you want to advertise, you want to have posters up at one of our conferences, you can do that. You don't have to pay for exhibit space. We'll put that up for you if you're a small business. We very much want small business to be involved. We try to go out of our way to make that happen. But the biggest thing I think we can do for small businesses is the environment that we provide at conferences, where the technical and the management people from a small company can interact with their colleagues in middle-sized and larger companies in government in an environment where they never could before. And if you're from ISPCS Rocket Ship and Pizza Company, and you've got a widget you want to sell, and you try to walk in and see the head of the NRO or the head of Space and Missile Systems Center or the head of JSC, it isn't going to happen. But if you're in an exhibit booth, for example, an AIAA conference, that person's probably going to walk by your booth, and you've got If you got your 30-second elevator speech down, you've got a chance to make that case. And it happens every time we have a conference.
Okay, last question.
You promise?
How would you advise this group to prepare for what is likely inevitable, and that's some kind of an accident during a commercial launch, something that has wide public attention?
You got to be really ready. You got to have your lawyers ready. You got to have your press kit ready. You've got to have the person that's going to stand in front of the media ready. It is going to happen. I'm looking at Wayne Hale, and I've been reading his blog, and the reality is it's going to happen, and the people that are involved in it, their hearts are going to be broken for a decade in the future. But you got to be ready for it. You got to work through it. One of the dilemmas with SpaceX right now, they had an engine out. One of the payloads didn't go where it was good. That's not important. They had an engine out. As far as NASA's concerned, as far as the press releases said, that was a successful mission. By the classic definition, did the payload get where it wanted to go when it wanted to get there? It was a successful mission. But if I'm somebody that's got $1 billion payload or a $2 billion payload or a bunch of pink bodies that I'm going to put on that payload, I don't want to rely on your engine out. I want that engine out to be the 1 time in 100, and then I say, thank God you could do that. I don't want it 2 times out of 3. And so in something like that, and I'm sure SpaceX is going to do it, you got to treat that as though it's an accident. You've got to walk down that fault tree and understand exactly why that happened and fix it so it doesn't happen again. You can't say, well, I can do engine out, so we're okay. So that's the kind of thinking that's got to really be disciplined into the process, as well as the lawyers and the public affairs and all that goes with that.
Let's thank Bob Dickman.